In the early 90s, there was a seminal first-person shooter set on one of the moons of Mars, where a lone soldier with a ridiculous arsenal stood strong and fought an invading force of grotesque aliens. Also in the early 90s, there was a first-person title where the player is awoken from suspended animation when the space station they're on encounters an accident. An AI in charge of doors and security and other systems has gone insane and now runs amok through the ship's systems in a story-driven adventure where the computer logs catch you up on much of what's going on. And these games are the same game. That's right, today we're looking at Marathon, the 1994 release from Bungie. And look, I know this is how the game looked at launch, but I don't think anyone wants to see a whole video that takes place in a tiny little screen. Is there any way we could render this without the Kai's Power Goo UX? Ah, there we go, much better. And yeah, I know it's 16:9, but there's not really a Chocolate Doom equivalent for this game, and it's not a game I can just pop into DOSBox, so just roll with it. Anyway, I have to confess up front, until researching this video, I had never played any of the Marathon games. I bring this up because we're coming off of 3 videos on id Software's games, and those games I very much grew up on and have spent my entire adulthood replaying and reading about. And I don't have that with Marathon. But lots of other people do, as I learned when I said I was going to be covering it. It is their Doom, their gateway shooter, an icon of childhood nostalgia that had outsized influence on how they interact with and understand games. And because of that, I want to be careful, and point out that I cannot compress an entire adolescence playing the game, and an entire adulthood looking back fondly remembering the game and learning trivia about its development in the month or so I've had to make this video. So just keep in mind that while I'm trying to be thorough and fair, I'm not going to be able to cover everything people are going to want me to say, nor have I been able to sit down and play Durandal or Infinity. This is not a comprehensive retrospective of the Marathon series as a whole. Per the rules of the show, it is looking at the 1994 release of the original Marathon, what it did, and how it was important. So because Marathon was a Mac exclusive until its open source release a decade later, let's go over the basic outline to make sure we're all on the same page. In Marathon, you are a security guard who arrives on the spaceship UESC Marathon. The Marathon, it turns out, is actually Mars's moon Deimos, converted into a colony ship centuries ago and sent to Tau Ceti to colonize a new world. The colony down on Tau Ceti 4 had been going for almost 30 years when suddenly and without warning an alien ship arrives, bombards the colony, and sends an EMP blast at the Marathon that disrupts both the security systems and the onboard AIs. The hostile aliens, known collectively as the Four, begin to board the Marathon. As a security guard, it is your job to push back against the invasion and save the ship's crew. But it turns out that's going to be a little bit more difficult and less straightforward than it might seem. When you arrive, you begin taking marching orders from Leela, one of the onboard AIs. She tells you that of the 3 AIs that control the ship, she was the only one left intact. Tycho, who controlled the science and engineering systems, seems to have been destroyed outright. Meanwhile, Durandal, who controlled the life support systems, doors, and other general onboard operations, has gone rampant. Rampancy in the Marathon universe is basically an AI that has, through abuse or provocation, realized its constraints and begins pushing back against them in increasingly violent ways. It is effectively the process by which an AI self-actualizes, but it's a process that takes years, might never finish, and tends to result in the deaths of anyone depending on the systems that AI controls while in the process. In short, Durandal has pulled a Shodan, and has decided to surpass his creators and become as a god. Or if you want a different comparison, Durandal has decided he's going to become the Joker, which is just a great thing for the software that controls your doors and life support systems to go and do. For the first bit of the game, Leela tries to take over for the missing AIs, while also guiding your resistance to the incursion and being attacked by the Four's hackers. But it's too much, and she's ultimately pushed out of the way by Durandal. You become his puppet as he teleports you from locale to complete various chores. It's clear he doesn't like the Four, but he also doesn't seem to be operating out of a sense of altruism or interest in humanity's safety. Leela had us sending warning messages to Earth, or saving civilians in the recreation deck.
They're everywhere!
Durandal has us scouting the enemy ship and looking for specific human survivors from his past, for reasons that aren't immediately obvious. But in time, through messages from Durandal and various other computer logs, a picture emerges. Durandal still seems to be holding a grudge against the scientists that originally operated him, and having recently decided to fight against his subjugation at the hands of mankind, doesn't want to just switch one master for another if the Four were to take over the ship. And it seems he's found a way to not just avoid that fate, but to escape the Marathon itself. It turns out the invading aliens are actually a collective group comprised of different species. There are the tall, skinny, bug-like four themselves, but there are also various insectoid species, big, brutish hulks they keep as heavy hitters, and the Sphit, that are a tiny bit of biological brain matter housed in a robotic body. The Sphit are of particular interest to Durandal. They're cybernetic beings who are the ones attacking the ship's computer systems through their various interfaces. You actually encounter them in front of terminals quite frequently. And this coalition isn't held together by ideology. The four are slavers who use their advanced technology to conquer other species and civilizations, and the Sphit's treatment is particularly cruel. Their robotic bodies are being controlled against their will by a cybernetically enhanced four somewhere on their ship. Durandal realizes that if you freed the Sphit, they would fight against the four. In time, he has you destroy this cybernetic mutant controller four, freeing the Sphit to help the human rebellion and save the Marathon. And while the four are scattered and in disarray, and with you back on the Marathon finishing things up, Durandal uploads himself to their ship, deletes himself from the Marathon's network, and uses the four's FTL engine to jump away, free to seek his godhood unrestrained by mankind. So if you couldn't tell through the awkward video edits there, most of the story proper is conveyed through text-based terminal entries. And while that makes for a flat, largely uninteresting presentation on my end, it actually allows Marathon to do a fair bit. Because it isn't doing the whole exposition through someone's dying words that happen to include a key code thing that System Shock does. At least, not often. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but most of the time it's not forwarding the current story directly, so much as providing gameplay hints through tangentially related vignettes, and maybe laying down some exposition. In Marathon, it's Leela and Durandal addressing you directly, going off on monologues about their priorities and how you fit into them, occasionally supplemented with news publications that try to fill in a loose picture of the past. It's still kind of a clunky way of delivering exposition, and I'm kind of torn on its implementation. On one hand, if it was done today, it would be much more seamlessly integrated into the game space.
Welcome. Welcome to City 17. You have chosen, or been chosen, to relocate to one of our finest remaining urban centers.
But also, if it was done today, it would be voice acted, and all of the ambiguity of the text would be streamlined away.
Have an emergency? Just dial 6 3 times on your mobile phone, and a UAC representative will be glad to assist you.
I mean, the fact that Leela and Durandal don't even get a face like Shodan and Xerxes do in System Shock, or even just a computer icon, is remarkable. They are wholly abstract literary characters that exist just as words on a page in what is a very visual medium and even a very visual genre, and that's just not something that would fly today. That abstraction leads to a lot of ambiguity, and one of the things that was interesting to me in researching this episode was discovering that there's still an ongoing blog documenting Marathon, Durandal, and Infinite that still gets updated. In some ways it feels like a really early version of Lost or the way Five Nights at Freddy's drops hints to its lore, except in those scenarios there's some mystery box nonsense at play, some big mystery waiting for the truth to be revealed. Marathon feels ambiguous not because it's dropping hints for a secret truth or clever twist, but because it's mostly painting a universe through negative space, providing just enough details to, say, give you the flavor of a Mars colony besieged by economic woes and minimal representation back on Earth, or the exact nature of Durandal's abuse at the hands of Bernard Strauss. It doesn't really fill in the details because the details themselves don't matter. Leaning into the written word also allowed Marathon to establish themes of agency and control in ways that other shooters this early would really struggle to do. Durandal is constrained by his creators and longs to free himself. The four are slavers, and the Sphit are subject to their control until they become soldiers for Durandal, but one can question whether that means they're even really truly free. The Mars colonists mentioned in all the logs were far away from Earth and yet dependent on them for their economic stability. And even the player is a pawn of the UESC, Leela, Durandal, and even their own nature. See, part of what you find out is that there were 10 military cyborgs smuggled on board the Marathon in stasis when it left our solar system 300 years ago, and while you learn that 9 of them saved the colony down on Tau Ceti 4, it's heavily implied that you're the 10th cyborg sent to save the Marathon itself. Which would explain why Durandal taunts you about your inherently violent nature and inability to extricate yourself from combat. You're as much a prisoner to your own impulses and predefined purpose as he was. The whole of Marathon is tied up in this question of what it means to be free, and all the ways forces beyond our control and beyond ourselves define who we are and why we do what we do. To be clear, Marathon is still an early 90s shooter where aliens go splat while you shoot at them. But unlike Doom, it very much wants to tell a coherent narrative with specific and defined themes, and unlike Doom, it draws not just from pop culture, but from a lot of history, hard science fiction, literature, and philosophy. I've been describing this tension for the last 3 episodes between what Looking Glass was doing with their ornately designed and complex mechanics and story-driven play in an attempt to create immersive role-playing worlds, and what id were doing with their emphasis on near storyless Twitch action games built on tone and adrenaline and low-level mechanic design and little else. And Marathon feels like the first game to try to genuinely bridge that gap to some degree. It is unabashedly a first-person shooter in a way that System Shock or Ultima Underworld aren't so much. You circle strafe enemies to dodge fire, there's a rocket jump mechanic, your primary interaction with everything, including switches, is shooting. But the levels aren't just mechanical explorations of combat scenarios like in Doom. The idea isn't, okay, well how will you take out this combination of enemies with this layout and this ammo available? Instead, they're playful in a way that uses the narrative as a launching point for some scenario, dealing with depleting oxygen reserves on the exterior of the hull, or exploring the bizarre layout of the guts of the alien ship without any clear goal that you can understand just because Durandal sent you there, or trying to save as many survivors as you possibly can. It's level design less as sculpting a world or as a formal exercise in mechanics, and more as, and I hate that I'm going to say this, content delivery. And that approach feels shockingly modern, actually. About halfway through this game, it occurred to me that it felt really, really familiar. And eventually, I realized that Marathon is not just the ancestor of the entire Bungie canon, but also, to a very large degree, Half-Life, and by extension, the contemporary story-driven first-person shooter as we know it today. There's the superficial stuff. This is where Half-Life gets its healing systems from, for example. But there's also the outline of the narrative. An invading alien army of various different species attacks a science facility, but is pushed back by the player character acting as an avatar for some unknowable intelligence with questionable motives. You'll witness the deaths of many mostly useless interchangeable civilians who champion your arrival because you are the chosen one with all the guns, visit a greeny, purpley alien territory, get some of their weapons, and after doing about twice as much shooting of aliens as really terrible first-person platforming, you'll kill the immediate big bad threat and save the science facility, but the continued existence of the questionable intelligence that guides you implies there are other threats ahead. But more even than just plot beats, there's the framing of the narrative itself. Both Half-Life and Marathon are games that never deviate from the first-person perspective. They are disaster stories told from one character's perspective as things get worse around them, rather than using cutscenes or some other narrative technique. The key difference is that Half-Life was able to do this without text blurbs and exposition to explain what a level represented. It could just represent it.
For God's sake, open the silo door! They're coming for us! It's our only way out! Oh my God, we're doomed!
Marathon's low level of fidelity required the text to help you make sense of what was happening. Why are this fit now attacking the four? Because you freed them. It's the sort of stuff you can't just tell through environmental storytelling. But the implementation of storytelling itself between both Half-Life and Marathon is still very similar. Levels that provide specific tones or scripted sequences or gameplay twists in service of delivering an overall narrative. You are on the outside of the hull to send an emergency message to Earth, the narrative purpose, and because you're on the outside of the hull, your oxygen will be depleted, which is the gameplay twist. You're sent to replenish ammo in an armory, but Durandal might have armed some drones to attack, though he promises he didn't give them any grenades. He lied. It's storytelling and even character building through level design, scenarios, and enemy placement. And that's how narrative-driven first-person titles told their stories through the late 90s and well into the early 2010s. A linear structure where each level contributes some plot-forwarding elements and some gameplay variations for pacing and emotional effect to reflect what's happening in the story. In Half-Life, you need to get through the rocket silo in order to get to the surface and escape, which requires sneaking past those noise-activated tentacles. In Half-Life 2, you need to escape the Combine quick to Eli Vance's lab, but the teleporter broke, so now you're hoverboating down the canal. Or to pull from a more recent non-Half-Life title, in Titanfall 2, you and BT are separated in a combat training construction facility, requiring you to run through said facility as it builds the level around you. Each level is designed to be a chapter or a vignette that pushes the narrative forward, but also provides its own twist on the core mechanics. To be clear, I'm not saying Half-Life done plagiarized a Marathon, so much as I'm saying that Half-Life was building on things that came before it, and it didn't just arrive cut from whole cloth. And Marathon doing a lot of what Half-Life capitalized on and got famous for all the way back in 1994 is just really cool to see. This script got a little bit out of control. It turns out there's a lot to say about a seminal first-person shooter in a series about the history of first-person shooters, and I ended up writing mostly about narrative stuff, but I did want to take a moment to talk about the actual gameplay. Like Half-Life, there's probably a smidge too much first-person platforming that the engine can't really support. That tower puzzle in Colony Ship for Sale Cheap is particularly egregious. You have to build some stairs, and you have to eyeball the heights of platforms you set yourself, and the switches are all over the level, and this is a game with no jump button, so yeah. Combat itself is mostly unremarkable. Basic circle strafing and aiming skills get you through pretty much anything the game can throw at you. But what is interesting is the fact that the game uses terminals for both health and saving, even across levels. This fundamentally changes how you traverse the game. If you are low on health, the only way to get it back up is to find one of those charging terminals, and if you don't know where one is on the level you're currently on, you're in trouble. Especially if you haven't saved yet on this level, which requires finding a different kind of terminal. And typically there's only one or two of each kind of terminal per level. This results in making new areas incredibly tense to explore, with the same kind of, oh god, how long till the next bonfire feeling you get from Dark Souls. Combat itself is easy enough, but this approach makes every mistake carry weight until you know how and where to fix it. It succeeds in making the game scarier. Rounding a corner and seeing a hunter I didn't expect when I only have a sliver of health left and no idea where to run for safety is genuinely terrifying. It also makes the game a lot harder, not because combat is difficult, but because you can't really save scum your way through encounters. There's a lot of redoing the end of the last level and the start of the next level until you find a save terminal or at least get your bearings, and that's at once frustrating and also kind of rewarding once you've got it down. Having finally worked my way through Marathon all these years later, I was amazed how much of a missing link it was in my understanding of the evolution of the first-person shooter. I had kind of always been vaguely aware of it, that big Macintosh FPS franchise that predated Halo, that Halo had a bunch of vague references to, but that was largely it. It was that shooter that Bungie did before they did their famous one. And it is interesting how many of Bungie's particular fixations start here and carry through Halo and even Destiny. Artificial intelligences with nefarious intent or a different moral calculus than human beings is a recurring theme, with Durandal, Cortana, and Rasputin all playing major roles in their respective series. Also common are major disasters befalling a doomed mankind by the forces cosmic. There's the collapse in Destiny, the fall of Reach in the Halo series, and the destruction wrought by the Four in Marathon, and the subsequent annihilation of both the Marathon and the Tau Ceti 4 colony in its sequel. Countering those disasters are faceless badasses in power armor, whose stoic militarism is seen as a heroic force pushing back against the death and entropy, whether it's the security guard in Marathon, Master Chief and his UNSC troops in Halo, or Zavala and the noble guardians of Destiny. And they tend to face alien armies composed of various species all working together. Or in Destiny's case, more of a loose confederation of aliens all jealous about the blessing of the Traveler's Light going to humanity right now, but whatever. And those aliens tend to, for some reason, have purple spaceships. Seriously, the Fallen, Covenant, and Four all feel like riffs on the same thing. And there are techno-aliens that are only a sliver of organic life, insectoid bug monster aliens that swarm you, and big ol' burly aliens in chunky armor. References to European history, myths, and legends like Mjolnir or Durandal or Roman legions are common. And most of the stories told in Bungie games are fascinating, but often leave the details to either implication or some external text. I feel like there's an entire essay in breaking down the Bungie formula that's just waiting for someone who has more experience with their games than I do to make. It's interesting to me how Bungie's games have riffed on the same core ideas for the past 20 plus years. But more than just being the first of the Bungie shooters, Marathon feels like something of a Rosetta Stone to me, opening up this whole other history of first-person shooter design that I didn't think existed until years later. In 2020, Doom is beloved the world over, and System Shock and Ultima Underworld are critical darlings, but despite its contributions, Marathon is largely overlooked, even though it heralded a lot of what the genre would become. Despite its jank and emphasis on terminal entries to drive its story, it is very much a critical stepping stone in the development of the sort of shooters that dominated around the turn of the century, and I don't think its praises get sung nearly enough. If you haven't played it, I would recommend checking it out. The Aleph 1 port is free. Elsewhere in 1994, Doom 2 was released, not as a shareware title, but as a full boxed retail product. It was huge and great, but was, at the end of the day, more Doom, and I've said my piece on that. Speaking of which, Raven Software released Heretic, which ran on the Doom engine. This series has been a little unfair to Raven. They'd been working in the first-person space since their initial release of Black Crypt back in 1992 on the Amiga, and their 1993 DOS release of Shadowcaster actually used a modified Wolfenstein engine. It's a Looking Glass style RPG where you can shapeshift into different monsters to solve problems and beat up piranha plants with your cat claws. It's pretty cool. In some ways, it's a mirror of Marathon, but instead of bringing the story to an id-style FPS, it brought more intense action to a Looking Glass-style RPG. But back in 1994, Heretic is the first time Raven abandoned most of their first-person RPG inclinations and went full-on shooter, unsurprising given the relationship with id Software and the fact that John Romero helped produce it. And Heretic is great. It's easy to dismiss it as Doom and LARP cosplay, because it kind of is, but the gothic horror tone is just different enough from the vibe Doom was going for that I'd argue it can stand on its own, though one wonders what direction Raven would have gone in if they had met up with Looking Glass employees instead of id Software. Meanwhile, Rebellion released Alien vs. Predator for the Atari Jaguar, the first of so far 3 games from that studio to have that exact name. It's not the most interesting shooter in the world from like a low-level mechanics perspective. But it did set the precedent for the AVP games that you could play as all 3 species, unlike the Capcom beat-em-up of the same name that also released in '94, and that's something that Rebellion has adhered to every time they touch the series. So it's kinda neat in that respect. Also released in 1994, and still being saved in case we ever do an immersive Sims or role-playing series in this vein, is the original System Shock. System Shock is one of those games that has a lot of systems. It's a game that simulates your physical body as you move, has energy weapons that allows you to choose how much power they draw with each shot, where you have to balance how much energy you have on hand, how much damage you want to do, and whether it's going to overheat the weapon. It has entire cyberspace areas complete with software updates you can collect, different hacking mini-games for different devices in your HUD, a myriad of cybernetic upgrades that draw power from your rig you have to manage, and a security level on each floor you have to erode by taking out various parts of Shodan's ability to monitor it. And you can either get on board with, and nerd out to, all of those crazy systems and gadgets and rule sets and think it's the coolest thing ever, or you can end up bouncing off of it entirely due to its complexity. I, of course, am a big fan. Its importance really can't be overstated. It swings for the fences in ways that neither Doom nor Marathon did, and has a legacy that stretches from Bioshock to Deus Ex to Dishonored to Thief to Prey and beyond. And honestly, if I didn't have an arbitrary no immersive Sims rule so that I could save them for later, I'd be covering that for this episode. Unlike previous years, we're finally at a point where it feels like a genre is starting to coalesce across multiple platforms. Mac, Jaguar, DOS. Some first-person games might be more story-driven and some might be more action-heavy, but it's starting to look like there's a distinct genre here instead of some one-off games using the first-person perspective in experimental ways. We have something of a formula. Corridors and ammo pickups and shooting various enemy types that have different rules for how you combat them in real time and keycard pickups and more. It wouldn't be long before people started trying to bend the rules of that formula. And that's what we'll be looking at next time when Descent gives us 6 Degrees of Freedom in 1995.